welcome. My name is Dr. Sarah Park-Dahlen. I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois School of Information Sciences, and I am really excited to see so many of you here, people who are interested in, maybe you're already part of the profession and you're thinking about coming back for a graduate degree. So hopefully we'll have a really great conversation today about what some of the possibilities are in this field. So by way of introduction, just want to share at the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about my life and how I got into this. As a person of color, I'm Korean American. I did not know that this was a career path that was that I could pursue. And then we'll talk about social justice in the profession. And then I'll talk more specifically about research, my research, and then other possibilities for research. And I know that my colleague, Sarah Schwabel, is also going to be talking about youth services in a panel, I believe, a presentation, I think, on Thursday. So hopefully there won't be too much overlap. And she has a lot of really great perspectives from her experience as well. And then we'll conclude by sharing some of the possibilities of moving forward together. These are two of my favorite words, forward and together, because this is work that we have to do together. So just want to start by sharing that when I was growing up, I did not see any people who looked like me in children's books. I grew up in a predominantly Asian American community. I had a lot of teachers who were non-white. Most of my classmates were Asian American. The white students were actually in the minority where I was growing up. But I still did not read any children's books that had Korean Americans in them. So I read books like In the Year of the Boar and Jackie Robinson, which is about a Chinese immigrant child. And then I also read the beloved Babysitters Club series, which I haven't finished season 2 of the Netflix show. So if you have, no spoilers. But yeah, I didn't know that Korean Americans could ever be in children's books. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school. Well, actually, so let me back up. I got my undergraduate degree in history and Asian American studies. And I thought I was going to be a high school history teacher. That's the career. That was one of the careers that my Korean American parents said I could do. And I loved history. And then when I discovered that Asian American studies was a thing, I loved Asian American studies. And so I wanted to be a high school history teacher. So then I went and got was getting my graduate degree in Asian American studies when I came across this picture book, Smoky Night. This picture book is set during the Los Angeles riots, or the uprisings, as we more appropriately call them. And it is from the perspective of an ambiguously brown child. We don't know if he's Latinx or if he's Black, but he lives in the midst of where all the fires and things are happening. And he talks about Mrs. Kim, who is across the street from him. So I know immediately that Mrs. Kim is Korean American. So it was interesting to me, as someone who is Korean American, grew up in Los Angeles, had a dad who owned a grocery store in South Los Angeles, to see a picture book that was set during something that was so huge in my life and have it not be from the perspective of a Korean person. And so I wondered, okay, so here's a perspective from this ambiguously brown person. Are there children's books set during the Los Angeles riots that are from the perspective of a Korean American? And when I started searching, I found these 2 books by Marie Lee. The first one is Finding My Voice. It's about a teenager named Ellen Sung, who grows up in Minnesota, is the only Asian American other than her sister. In saying goodbye, she goes to Harvard, where she meets a boy who grew up in Los Angeles, whose parents owned some kind of a small business. I forgot if it was a grocery store or a gas station. And his parents lost everything during the LA uprisings. So I did find that representation. However, it was through Ellen's perspective. It was on the other side of the country, and it was after the fact. And so it was close, but like not quite close enough. So that's what got me interested in studying Asian American and more specifically Korean American children's books, knowing that there was a body of literature out there. Because when I found Marie Lee's books, I found her chapter books. I found at the same time picture books by Yang Suk Choi and Song Yeon Choi, who are not related. And immediately, the year that I was in graduate school, these two books had been published the year before. Both Linda Sue Park's A Single Shard and Anna's A Step from Heaven were published in 2001. And as you can see on the cover of A Single Shard, Linda Sue Park won the John Newbery Medal in 2002, which is the year I started graduate school. And A Step from Heaven actually won the Michael L. Prince Award that same year. So suddenly Korean American children's literature was exploding all over children's literature, just discussions and conferences. And Linda Sue Park came to the Los Angeles Public Library, and I got to meet her along with other Korean American librarians who I was beginning to meet. And as I began, deciding that this was what I wanted to do, I wanted to be a children's librarian. I wanted to be the kind of person who shared these books with young readers, not just Asian American readers, but with all readers, with white readers and Black readers and all readers, because everyone should know all of our stories. So I thought I was going to go to graduate school again to get my master's degree in library and information science. But as I was researching for my Asian American Studies master's degree thesis, I realized that there was not a lot of research on Asian American children's books. And so I thought, well, maybe I should go get a PhD. And if I'm honest with you, my mom told me that I should go and get a PhD. Dr. Clara Chu told me, who I was working with at the time, she told me that I should go get a PhD. So it wasn't my idea to go get a PhD. I had these Asian American elders in my life who told me to go get a PhD in library science and study Asian American children's books. So this is me in my early 20s, meeting Linda Sue Park for the first time, meeting a Korean American children's book author for the first time. When my daughter was 3 months old, she met Linda Sue Park and Kate DiCamillo on the same day at the same time. She also met John Coy, who's a very good friend of mine, another children's book writer. She met him maybe 5 minutes before she met these two. So technically, Linda Sue Park is not the first author she met, but yeah, like she's going to have a very different experience growing up, knowing that books like Bibimbap exist when I didn't know that they existed until I was in my 20s. So today's generation of children already have a different experience. And that's not to say that I don't still meet parents, caregivers, and teachers who don't know a whole lot about diverse literature. So there's still a lot of work to do. But yeah, so just, my childhood, and I went over that a little bit. And then raising a reader, like with my 7-year-old, just making sure that she has access to a lot of different kinds of stories. And then, so as I mentioned, my undergraduate degrees are in Asian American Studies. And then I went and I got a master's degree in Asian American Studies, and my thesis was on Korean American children's picture books. And then I left UCLA, graduated, left, and then started my PhD and master's degrees in library science here at the University of Illinois, where I'm now an associate professor. And when you go from a master's degree to a PhD, like when you start your PhD, you want to have a good idea of what you want to study. It'll be a lot more efficient that way. So it's like this balance of being very open to learning about new things, because when you're in grad school, you want to be open, know that you don't know everything yet and that there's so much to learn. But you want to choose something that you're going to go very, very deep into. And so I decided within Korean American children's books that I was going to study representations of transracial Asian adoption. And that's what I did for my PhD thesis. So then I spent 12 years as faculty at St. Catherine University. It's what we call a SLAC, a small liberal arts college. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota, about 10 miles from where Philando Castile was shot, actually. And then now I'm faculty at the University of Illinois, which is a research university, or what we call an R1 or a Tier 1 research university. So at a SLAC, there's a lot more emphasis on teaching. And then at a place like the University of Illinois, there's a lot more emphasis and support for research. And so if there's a better balance of where we spend our time when we're at the University of Illinois. I love teaching. I love teaching. I love spending time with students and learning from and with students. And so it's like I was I was sad to leave St. Kate's in the sense that I wasn't going to be interacting with as many students, but it's really great to be at the University of Illinois where we have a PhD program. We didn't have a PhD program at St. Kate's. And so to be able to mentor students who are taking that career trajectory. So talking about social justice work in library and information science, there is an article written by my colleague Todd Honma. Todd actually was getting his master's degree in Asian American Studies, and he was in a joint program with information studies at UCLA at the same time as I was there. So we were in the same cohort for Asian American Studies. And so I kind of, he's one of the people who like really introduced me to information studies at UCLA. But his thesis basically was what we see here, the article Tripping Over the Color Line, the Invisibility of Race in Library and Information Studies. And the thesis of his article is basically that we have not done a good job talking about race and racism in the information profession. And even like the title here, social justice work in library science, it sounds very nice, right? It sounds very like aspirational. So much about librarianship is aspirational. We have all these ideals that we're trying to live up to. But what Todd Honma is saying is that we're not using the specific language that we actually need to like change things in library and information science. And so one of the things that he did was he searched to see how many times words such as like race or racism or white supremacy or diversity or multiculturalism showed up in our library literature. And what he found that people really liked talking about multiculturalism and they really liked talking about diversity, but according to the research, they didn't use words about race and racism and white supremacy as much. And so that kind of stunts our ability to have actual conversations about the problems that we face as a field. And this past year, Sophia Leung and Jorge R. Lopez McKnight co-edited a book called Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Science Through Critical Race Theory. Critical race theory is not scary. It's a framework. It's a legal framework for understanding our lived experiences, what we materially have access to, et cetera. So it's a way of understanding things, right? To study things through the lenses of race and the impacts of race. And so they similarly say that LAS has framed the race problem as one of diverse representation of racialized bodies rather than one of racial power, domination, and privilege. And basically what they're saying here is that we in library and information science focus a lot on having non-white people in the room. But that doesn't change power dynamics. It doesn't change who has power and authority. If just because we have more brown bodies in the room, it doesn't mean that those brown bodies are in positions of leadership, right? They could still be in positions of sort of subjugation or be dominated over, right? And we certainly don't always have privilege. And so how can we move beyond talking about diversity, talking about multiculturalism, and actually disrupt systems of power and systems of domination and systems of privilege? And what I'm saying to you today is that we need a lot more people who think like this to enter the information profession, so that we're not just brown bodies in the profession, but that we're actually creating the changes that we need to upset the power dynamics and make sure that this field is more equitable and working for everybody. And so I'm starting with some sort of assumptions or statements. Public libraries are inherently white supremacist organizations. We have a history of segregation. They were similar to things like the founding documents, right? They were created by and for white men, not even for females, right? Even the earliest libraries, most of them were meant only for men. And if you think about how libraries have been segregated even within our own lifetimes, right? So if you have read the graphic memoir March by Congressman John Lewis, he talks about in his National Book Award speech when he won the National Book Award for, I think it was the second or the third book, he talks about how when he was a child, he wasn't even allowed inside a library. And now he's winning this like National Book Award for a book that's probably going to be inside every single library because it has a medal on the cover, right? And so when we think about how libraries were segregated, even within our own lifetimes, then we know that we still have a lot of work to do because that racism is residual and it's still around with us today. There's a lot of talk in our profession about whether or not libraries, information, and library workers are objective or neutral spaces. And you can look up YouTube videos of panels and you can read articles that have lots of different takes on this. But as I said, with public libraries are inherently white supremacist organizations, we are not neutral and we are not objective either. Everything is ideological, right? And so how do we approach our work with this in mind, knowing that we don't know everything and that we don't always take the right stance and that our policies can be laced with white supremacy and anti-Blackness or anti-Asianness or anti-class, whatever it is. How can we fight against that, right? And by going to library school and learning more about our histories and strategies for change, hopefully that's something that we will grapple with less in the future. As I said before, library science loves adding Black and Brown people to LIS spaces. We love it. We want to see, we want to like go into a room and see more Black and Brown people, but that is not enough. Because as I said, if that is not transforming the space, if it is not transforming the policies, then all we've done is add a little color. And that does not change systems. It does not change the ideologies. It does not change the environment. In fact, it could be very toxic and harmful for those Black and Brown people who enter into a library science space. So this is sort of like a catch-22, right? Like we need these Black and Brown people to come in, and a lot of them are probably going to be doing this transformative work, but it can't also just be on our shoulders. Like the people who have privilege, and here I'm just going to say the white people who are in positions of authority and who have privilege also have to be invested in making changes and making these LIS spaces more hospitable for Black and Brown people. So yeah, the whole field needs to be transformed and we all need to be invested in doing that work. So library work, especially public library work, is inherently social justice work. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. We have to both recruit and retain Black and Brown people in this profession. So April Hathcock has a really powerful article that she published on in the Library and the Lead Pipe, which is an open access journal, where she writes about how we have a lot of really great diversity initiatives, scholarships and fellowships and things like that. But we're bleeding as many people out of the profession as we are recruiting. So we're doing a really great job recruiting. We're not doing such a great job retaining. So how can we work on that and do better, right? And so we have to transform entire LIS institutions to do that. And when we start with education, with library science programs, and we have to have transformative coursework. And so this takes the work of the instructor of the class who should have their eyes open on what's going on in the field and incorporate a lot of this, the scholarships, such as assigning the Knowledge Justice book or Todd Honma's article in their classes and having conversations so that students have a foundation of talking about these topics, as well as on the students to bring to the class scenarios or readings or frameworks to think about how what we're learning in the classroom can actualize like social change in libraries. And again, it's the work of all of us to build community among library science professionals, students, et cetera, and safe spaces, particularly for those of us who are in the minority here. One of the really great ways that ALSC, the Association for Library Services to Children, has done this is at some of their recent events, they have held like a separate Zoom event just for BIPOC library science library professionals. And so, there have been times when I've gone to ALSC events very early in my career, and I look around and I'm like the only person in the room, and it could be a little bit awkward. Like, I always notice when I'm the only person of color in the room. That has happened in my classroom as well when I'm the only person of color. But recently, because there have been more Black and Brown people, there have been so many more times when I am not the only person of color. And when an organization or an association sees that and creates a specific space for us to gather, that shows that they recognize that it's valuable for us as BIPOC to have a separate space where we could be in community with one another. Let's see. So moving on, these are some of the things that libraries, public libraries, I'm talking specifically about public libraries here, that we do that are just inherently like, justice related. So obviously we provide information, and we also provide media literacy skills. Like we help people learn how to read and help people interpret information and things like that, right? And this is especially important as we are facing increasingly more and more instances of fake news, helping people discern what is factual and what is not, how to spot a bad website and things like that. In terms of collections, if you do any kind of collection development, it's really important to be responsive to your community needs and not collect just like the popular books that you like to read, right? Like there's a way to do collection development. And one of the ways that we do it is by assessing community needs, asking the community what kind of resources they want, right? And then making sure that we are providing accessible materials. So for example, materials in Braille, or providing, if we know that we have an older population in our community, then we might purchase more items that are printed in like large print, or audiobooks. There's a raging conversation on Twitter right now about, I don't know, I guess someone said that audiobooks is not real reading. And a lot of people have been like, well, actually, I do a lot of my reading on audiobooks, or for people who are vision impaired, like audiobooks are, a really necessary and wonderful way to access these great books, right? And so making sure that our collections provide accessible materials, using the example of, if you have an older community, then maybe you're going to provide, more large print, but you have to know that you have to know your community demographics to know things like that. A lot of librarians are doing diversity audits these days. And for that reason, I actually assign a diversity audit as the final project in a lot of my classes. And basically what this is when you choose like a topic or maybe a community, and you audit the collection to see what kind of materials are in the collection. So for example, I had a pair of students who wanted to audit a library system to see what kind of Asian American teen literature was collected by that library. And so they, did a whole bunch of like keyword searches, and they also like looked at lists of very well-reviewed Asian American teen lit, and checked to see whether or not the library system had those books. And then, they asked me to be co-author with them. And so we ended up doing the research together, and we published an article out of it. So that was one way that we did a diversity audit to check. What was really interesting is that, like, as the years went by, we found that they were collecting fewer books, but the books that they were collecting were increasingly written by non-Asian Americans. And so we were like, what is going on here? And in another audit that students have done, they took, for example, like all of the recent winners of the Coretta Scott King Award, all the recent winners of the Buddha Belpré Award, of the American Indians Librarian Association Awards, and the Apollo Award. I think it was maybe like the last 5 years or something. And they audited a library collection to see how many of those books had been collected by that library, how many copies of each book they had, and things like that. And so by doing such an audit, you can see where the gaps are in your collection. And if you live in an area with a lot of Asian Americans, it might be important for your library to collect more books so that the community members can see themselves. It is also really important for non-Asian Americans to see books with Asian Americans in them, especially these past couple of years because of the escalation in anti-Asian hate, to see us as fully human, to know that we are not forever foreigners and things like that. So there's a lot of different reasons why you should do a diversity audit. And a lot of different ways to do the diversity audit. Obviously, family engagement is a really important thing that a library does. And, from a very young family that is beginning to bring their baby to the library, getting early literacy support is really, really important. For a family that maybe does not have access to a lot of print materials in their home, bringing a family to a library so the children can be surrounded by books and borrow books and take them home. That's really, really important. Genealogy services is a huge, huge hobby. I think it's like the #1 hobby of like an older group of people, right? So like retirees, et cetera. This is their favorite activity to do. And so making sure that like libraries provide those kinds of services. And also, I'll also say, as someone who does transracial Asian adoption studies, these kinds of services are really, really important for people who are doing birth searching. So Korean adoptees might not be using this service in an American public library because their birth histories are in Korea, but domestically adopted people who are searching for birth relatives or birth histories, if they know that the family they were born in was raised in like Detroit, Michigan, then going to the Detroit Public Library and learning a little bit about the community and maybe looking up a yearbook or something might help them to piece together parts of their birth history and their birth family story. So providing those kinds of services is really, really important for people who have been denied that kind of information. Other programs and services that public libraries do, prison librarianship outreach is a huge one. As I'm sure you know, we have the highest rate of incarceration out of all of the countries in the world. It is hugely embarrassing. And you probably also know that the majority of people who are incarcerated are Black and brown males. And so this has a tremendously just detrimental impact on their families and communities. Prison librarianship is a service where there's, for example, at Hennepin County Library, there's one person named Dan Murco, and he facilitates library book access for people who are incarcerated. And that includes juveniles, that includes just, the regular jail. And so making sure that people have both leisure items to read, as well as if they are looking for other kinds of information, maybe they're doing research on their case, their trial is coming up and they want to make sure they have all the information they need. So providing services to people who have been imprisoned is a really important service. Services to homebound patrons, and an example here is maybe someone who is residing in some kind of like a senior home. Maybe they don't drive anymore, and so they can't get to the library. So a lot of libraries have services where they will take requests, or maybe there might be like a depository, a library depository at a senior citizen home or something like that, and the residents there can come and choose from among the books. So services to homebound patrons is also incredibly important. And libraries also provide programming in the ways of like public lectures. So I think it was Ramsey County Library in Minnesota, when Black Lives Matter was becoming more well-known and more prominent and really gaining traction. Ramsey County Library asked Dr. Duchess Harris, who's a legal scholar and American Studies professor at Macalester, to come and give a series of lectures about the history of anti-Blackness, legal exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. I believe it was 3 to 4 weeks or so. I went to nearly all of her lectures, but providing space for that kind of learning so that people who don't know where the fight for Black lives came from can go to a series of lectures and learn about the history of anti-Blackness in this country. I mean, she literally started with like the Declaration of Independence. She also published a book on it, children's book. So, now at the time it was pretty new when she published that book. Now there's a lot more out there about Black Lives Matter for young people. And then again, one of the most important things the library can do is preserving local history and making it accessible to community members. Other justice work that libraries do are providing services for immigrants and refugees. An example of that is providing language classes and citizenship classes. As you probably know, you have to take a citizenship test to become an American. And so providing space for those kinds of services is really, really important. And I'm thinking now about how we are welcoming so many refugees from Afghanistan and all the different services they'll need. And I have seen libraries like on, in the Facebook groups I'm in and in other spaces, people talking about what is your library doing, to welcome, refugees from Afghanistan into your community. And so libraries are all like, even before they arrived, they began thinking about how can we help? And that is such a good proactive attitude to have, right? So other lending services, some libraries provide gardening and kitchen tools. And so, this is really good for, just to be like more sustainable, right? And, if you, the other thing that, if you like read articles and people are like, why are libraries giving or loaning out gardening tools and kitchen tools and ties and things like that? Well, you might not need to buy, you can save your money by borrowing instead of buying some of these things, but you can get your garden going and you can, like grow things and not have to go like drive to the grocery store to buy green onions if you can just grow them in your home. Ties, like people who are, on the job market, but they don't have a lot of spare money to dress, quote, dress for the part, right? And so when a library can provide something like that maybe they're just going to use it a couple times, they don't have to buy it, but they could just borrow it from the library. And then again, similar to the lectures and stuff like that, libraries provide community spaces. Ideally, they should be safe spaces. We're having a lot of conversations about this right now because of policing in libraries and who those police tend to monitor. But ideally, libraries should be safe spaces. And I'm thinking here of, there's not a lot of spaces that young people can go to without being seen as a nuisance, but they can go to a library and they can hang out in the meeting rooms. They can, read books, they can hang out outside and, in the garden area or wherever. And there's no expectation that if you're spending time in a library that you're going to buy something, right? Like it's an anti-capitalist perspective. Like you don't come to a library to spend money. In fact, a lot of libraries, when you borrow books from the library and you've got your little receipt that says, which books you borrowed and what day they're due, at the bottom, they'll often say, you saved X amount of dollars by borrowing this item from the library. So it's actually quite, there is really no expectation that you're spending, but that you're saving money. So that's an important thing that libraries do, providing community spaces. And then obviously employment. Libraries should have a diverse staff that reflects the community demographics. And whenever I say something like this, I don't mean like a one-to-one parity, but generally like the staff should reflect generally the community demographics. So in terms of research, this is sort of my path. So I should have put up here actually that I started with Asian American Studies and then sort of, I don't want to say the word pivot, but when I got my PhD, I went from an Asian American Studies program to a Library and Information Science program. And within Library and Information Science, then you have youth services, and within youth services is youth literature, and more specifically diversity in youth literature, and then more specifically within that, Asian American youth literature. And then my dissertation was on transracial Korean adoption in youth literature. So I don't know, looking at this now, I kind of think I should have used a different graph, but I think you get the idea. So in terms of research, so I started studying transracial Korean adoption. As a Korean American, it was a topic that was interesting to me. But when I was in my master's degree program, I think there were 12 of us, and one of the other students was a Korean adoptee. And so I was learning about adoption through her lived experience while studying these Korean American picture books that depicted an entirely different experience. They were very, my family is forever and I love you so much. And all of that is very important. We want young children to feel affirmed in their families and loved by their families. But what she was going through with like her birth search and the kinds of questions she had about being racially different from her parents and the way she was raised and stuff. That was not in any of the children's books that I was studying, picture books through young adult novels. And so that was really interesting to me. And I blogged a lot about what I was finding. It had not yet quite become my dissertation topic yet, but a school librarian must have come across my blog because she emailed me and she was like, I have this book called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the Korean people in this book are presented pretty badly. They just keep abandoning children. And these children are adopted by Americans. So I don't know if this is a good book. I don't know enough about this time period or the whole situation. Like, what do you think of this book? And when I got that email, I was like, oh, this is a reader's advisory and a collection development issue. This is like absolutely a library science topic. If we flood our collection with books that don't talk about, like gender issues in Korea that lead more women to place their children for adoption. If we only have picture books that take place in the United States about the adoptees' experiences after they arrive with their adoptive family, then we are missing a huge part of an adoption story. So that's the reason why I decided to study transracial Korean adoption in youth literature, because it was being sort of very like myopically represented, just like a very narrow view for young readers. I've also worked together with We Need Diverse Books. Natalie Optebeek is a scholar at a university on the West Coast, and she was editing a collection of chapters. And she said, Sarah, I think we need a chapter about sort of where We Need Diverse Books fits into the history of diversity activism in youth literature. And she asked me if I would write such a chapter. And so I said yes. And I wrote this chapter, and it was published last year. I've also researched representations of activism, different forms of activism, environmental activism in youth literature. It's an essay that I co-wrote with a colleague of mine, Christina Rhodes, who's at Shippensburg University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And that's going to be published in Cambridge Encyclopedia, I think in a couple of years. It's still being reviewed by the editors. And then anti-indigeneity, there is a children's book series called, the character's name is Alvin Ho. It's written by Lenore Look and illustrated by Luan Pham, who are generally really great authors and illustrators. I've enjoyed a lot of their other works. But in this particular chapter book series, which when I started reading it, I really loved, because Alvin has an anxiety disorder and he goes to therapy, and he's a Chinese American child. His parents don't speak broken English. He gets in trouble. They get mad at him. It's very funny. And Luan Pham is a phenomenal illustrator. But in one of the books, it's a series, I think there's like 9 books now. In the 3rd or 4th book, Alvin Ho goes to a birthday party. His friend Hobson is having a birthday party, and the theme is settlers and Indians. And so he's like dying to dress up as a Native American chief to go to this birthday party. And there is no critique of it in the book. Like, his parents don't say, hey, you shouldn't do this. They get mad at him when he does a lot of other things. He gets in trouble for a lot of things, but they don't say anything to him about this. And
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Whoops, sorry. I think my Siri heard me say something and wanted to talk. But yeah, so it wouldn't have been out of character for Alvin Ho's parents to say, hold on a second, we don't dress up as Native Americans and here's why. And that book doesn't do that. And so I wrote a chapter about that, and kind of how I was disappointed in these Asian American children's book creators for putting this in a book so uncritically. Together with some of my sister colleagues, I contributed to a couple of articles about Black Lives Matter in library and information science. This is an urgent conversation that we all need to be a part of, and we all need to be working toward and working against anti-Blackness in library science and in all of our lives. And so did a little bit of research there. I think in the last time I presented about it together with some of my sister colleagues at a conference a couple months ago, and just kind of talked about as an Asian American doing this work, also at the same time, anti-Asian racism is escalating, and how does all of this intertwine? So that was something that I did. And then once you sort of like do a lot of this research and become known a little bit for it, you might be called on to be what's called a sensitivity reader or an expert consultant. And so publishing companies such as Scholastic and Penguin Random House have emailed me and asked if I would be a sensitivity reader for a manuscript, look at the way that Asian Americans are depicted, are there stereotypes in these illustrations, stereotypes such as slanted eyes and things like that. So that is something that I do alongside my day job of teaching and doing research at the iSchool. People who study children's literature also are interested not just in individual books, but in examining the systems that produce and circulate those books. So looking at publishing, librarianship, and things like that. And I'll get to that, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. And then, yeah, so examining how the literature is used, how it's circulated and stuff. And then partnering with libraries, schools, and publishers to do that research. We do a lot of public facing work. Professors are increasingly expected to be public, to give interviews, to be on podcasts, to blog, and all these things. So I'm going to show you a few examples of my public facing work. I wanted to show you this first, though. It's the We Need Diverse Books organization logo on the right. And then my friend Mike Jung, who's a writer of children's books, he writes middle grade. When We Need Diverse Books was founded in 2014, the people who founded it encouraged people to hold up a sign and post it on Twitter saying why we need diverse books. And when Mike posted this, my daughter was 5 months old, but when she was 3, I thought about this every single day. This is one of my motivations for doing the work that I do. And it was one of my motivations even before I had children. So in 2014, Lee and Low, which is the largest diverse children's book publisher in the country, asked if I would partner with them to survey publishing. And what they wanted to do was they put together a survey using sort of like census data or census categories, labels, trying to see how diverse the publishing industry was. We had much smaller scale surveys before this, but this was on a much larger scale. We surveyed over 20,000 people and had a pretty high return rate. And this was important because we needed a baseline. So this is called the diversity baseline survey. If you look at the very bottom right, it says diversity baseline survey. And now we call it 1.0 because there's a 2.0. But we found that publishing was very homogenous looking at these. And so this is overall, but like we also had graphs that showed, for example, like on the executive level. And for the executive level, race was much more white and gender was much more balanced. So it was more white and more male the higher up you went in sort of the executive chain, which surprises no one. That's how it is in every field, right? In 2015 or 2016, I worked together with an illustrator in Minnesota and the Cooperative Children's Book Center to produce an infographic that showed the lack of diversity in children's book publishing. So, you know, the CCBC had prior to this put up tables on their website, and we could interpret the data in the tables, but what was often missing was the 12.5%. What percentage of American children's books have animals, trucks, and other inanimate characters as protagonists? And so we thought it was really important to create an infographic where we could show that, and also show, like, you know, just by visually, you can see that the rabbit has a really big mirror, the white kid has a lot of mirrors, and then the kids of color and the indigenous color on the left have increasingly smaller mirrors. So we updated our infographic in 2019 using the 2018 data. The bear and the white kids still have a lot of mirrors. And now the 4 kids on the left have cracks in their mirrors. So we wish that we had thought to do this with the 2015 infographic, but we didn't until we got to 2019. But those cracks are meant to show that not all of the reflections are true like sort of accurate reflections, that there's a lot of distortions in the way that children's literature depicts us. As a professor, I am interested in both producing scholarship as well as supporting others who want to produce scholarship. And so I co-founded with some of my colleagues a journal called Research on Diversity in Youth Literature. And if you were paying attention back in March and you heard about the Seuss announcement saying that Seuss Enterprises was going to stop publishing 6 of their books because they contained content that was hurtful and wrong, which, you know, really actually should say that was racist. This is an article that we published 2 years before that got a lot of attention. And you might, if you want to look to the bottom right, you see that at the time when I took the screenshot, we had 285,000 downloads, but now we have over 330,000 downloads, which is pretty remarkable for an academic article. Riddle, which we call it Riddle for short, is an open access journal, and we deliberately designed it to be an open access journal so that people outside of academia could also access this research. And so because I can see the back end as the editor of the journal, I know that people at Penguin Random House have looked at this article, and I know that people in the Department of Defense have looked at this article. And I know that people all over the country have looked at this, or all over the world actually have looked at this article. So I just want to talk real quick, and I know I'm getting close on time, that the way the statistics look for faculty and the profession. So faculty are majority white. I don't think that surprises anyone at 59%. And then I put Black, other, and Asian underneath. And then the LIS profession is also even more so majority white. And I want to call your attention to LIS faculty, the 14% Asian. In my experience, the majority of those Asians are people who came here as PhD students, were not like Asian American like me, the majority in my experience. And in my experience also, a lot of them are not necessarily like Asian American studies majors who came into library science and are doing anti-racist work. They're doing important work in terms of, you know, human computer interaction and computer science and all these things, but they're not necessarily creating the ruptures that Sophia Lung and Jorge Lopez McKnight were talking about to like transform these systems, right? And so when we think about who's teaching in our library science programs and the content that we're teaching, you can look at, there are lots of articles about reviewing syllabi, library science syllabi, and what kind of cultural competence classes or diversity classes we're teaching in our programs. And we need to be doing a lot more of that. And we need a lot more people to be doing a lot of that. And so when you came into the session, I don't know if you came here because you want to be a librarian, and so you're looking to get a master's degree, or if you want to get a PhD and maybe join me as a faculty. But I put both of these here so that you could see what the profession looks like and what the people teaching the people in the profession look like. So I think I have one more slide. So moving forward together, there are lots of possible career paths. As I said, being a library science faculty where you do research, teaching, and service to the profession is things like serving on an ALA committee. That is definitely something that I am really excited about. As I said, Illinois has a really strong PhD program, and I am very interested in recruiting people who want to join me in doing this anti-racist work. If you want to be a public librarian or a school librarian, obviously this is a great place for you. If you want to go into publishing, you want to study youth services here and get a master's degree, that's also a viable career path. We need a lot more people who have this like anti-racist mindset to work as editors, reviewers, in marketing and things like that. Then if you want to, you know, own a bookstore and do, you know, programming at a bookstore, if you decide that you're going to be some kind of a caregiver, maybe a stay-at-home parent or something like that, then you will be a very well-equipped stay-at-home parent if you have a master's degree or a PhD in library and information science. So I think that might be the end of my slides. But yeah, so here I am, SP Dolan at illinois.edu, and my website, and Moises also put my faculty profile. So I am going to now, I want to see all of your faces. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And there we go. Okay. Amy Harmala has a question about determining a community's ethnic demographics and building a library collection that fills the needs of that community. So I'll give you an example. I recommend looking at the ALA editions like Neil Simon, Scarecrow Press, any of the librarianship, like professional journals. So ALA editions published a book titled Muslims in Story, and that's written by two people who are Muslim. And so that book gives a lot of background information about that community and the great diversity within that community, and then also suggests a lot of like materials, resources, programming ideas, and things like that. So I would look to the library science literature publishers and then make sure that you're looking at books that are written by people who have the lived experience or the expertise to write about that topic. Let's see.
Professor Dallin, would you be willing to convert your slideshow to a PDF to share with possibly?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did someone else have a question? Amy? Oh, okay, that was Amy's question. Okay.
You've covered all the questions. There was just that one. So if anyone else wants to ask a question, you are more than welcome to do so at this time. But a lot of people have just been putting in how much they appreciate the work that you're doing and appreciate the session.
I'm glad to hear that.
Perhaps I can help facilitate some conversation in case people are feeling a little shy right now. But maybe, Professor Dallin, would you share maybe some first steps as to how people could start the conversation in their local libraries, or start looking for maybe some more multicultural options to put in their libraries?
Yes. So if we're talking specifically about resources, like children's literature, I would look at social justice books. And then I would also looking at the blog, I would look at the blog roll for Reading While White. So Reading While White is put together by a group of like more activist white librarians. But they say, like, if you go to that website, they say at the front, you should look at all these other people first and then come back and look at us. And so I share that just because I want you to know that I'm not pointing you to white people. I'm trying to point you to, people of color and Indigenous people who are doing this work. But that website is has a really great list of those people. If you're already working in a library and you're trying to figure out how to start by talking to your coworkers and seeing who is on the same page or who can be brought along, and figuring out who you need to talk to change those systems, policies or whatever. Like, for example, for a while, one of our local public libraries was not allowed to buy self-published books because they had not been reviewed by the major journals, or their purchasing system was such that they had to go through a vendor or whatever. And so if you know that, but you know that like someone of self-publishers such as Zetta Elliott is publishing really fantastic books that young people like to read, then you have to go back and you have to figure out how to change that policy of, like being able to buy directly from Zetta Elliott instead of having to go through a vendor. So figuring out how things work and what needs to be changed in order for you to get the resources that your community really needs. Talk to your community. There are probably, community organizations all around you, and they have resources. Partner with them to see what kind of, maybe they would appreciate having your space to do a program, and then you reach like their community as well as other communities, right, in order to host a program. But talk to your communities and see what it is that they want, and then bring that to your library director or whoever it is who you have to talk to in order to make something happen. But make sure that you're not doing this alone, whether it is the people who are your coworkers, or if you're part of an association, if you're like, a youth services librarian and you're a member of ALSC and you're a member of that BIPOC community within ALSC, just make sure that who's going to support you in doing this work. Neil, that's such an interesting question. People who work on the back end, like technical services. Yeah, I mean, like as an employee, you can advocate for, like if you're not necessarily doing things on the back end, but you know that your colleagues on the front end are trying to get something done, just supporting them in that work. If there's like a voting system, to make changes, like making sure that you show up to vote, amplifying, talking to people who you need to amplify. And then if there's something even within technical services that where some kind of bias is embedded within technical services, then being aware of that and figuring out how you can also change things on the back end. So talk to other people who do similar work as you and see if they have gone through things, if they have had to change things, because maybe there is an issue that you haven't seen yet and you didn't know it was an issue, but you talked to your colleague at the library, across the county, and they tell you about it, and then now you know about it and you know that you have to fix it in your library. So I mean, I think so much of this is having a community of people around you to talk to about these issues and to figure out solutions together. Abdina, that's such a good question. So I got my master's and my PhD at the iSchool 13 years ago. And I think I got a really great education there. I would be lying if I said it was perfect, but no library school you go to is going to have everything that you need. One of the reasons why I chose the University of Illinois is because we have really great ethnic studies programs on this campus and a really diverse student body. As an Asian American Studies major, I wanted to be on a campus that had an Asian American Studies program. And so when I saw that the University of Illinois does have an Asian American Studies program, I was like, okay, I can go there. Right now, we have an incredibly diverse student body. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I haven't been able to meet all of them, but I know that they're there and they're pretty active. And I don't know if Moises wants to jump in and share a little bit more about that, but we are having conversations about changing our curriculum, being more responsive to student needs and student requests for what kinds of classes to teach. So as an example, I proposed my Asian American Children's Lit class this semester, and they approved it right away, and it is being taught next semester. So in that sense, I do feel supported in the work that I do. I mean, even the fact that they hired me with me being outspoken about the things that I am, I think shows a commitment. And so, yeah, if you want to talk more, I'm happy to chat. I'm sure Moises is also happy to chat. We could probably connect you with current students who can share frankly about their experiences, if you'd like.
Yeah, most definitely. So again, Dr. Dahlin, amazing work. Really appreciate your contribution and your advocacy for diverse texts, books, and experiences. As far as the type of support that we offer Black, Indigenous, people of color, we are one of the top destinations for ALA Spectrum Scholars. Over the past 3 years, we've received and welcomed the most. And the reason that I'm sharing this is that we actually offer a full tuition waiver for up to the 40 credit hours that you need to complete your LIS degree, whether it's in person or online. And it's a huge financial weight lifted for students of color that pursue our degree program. We actually met today at 12 with the fall 2021 cohort, and many of them cited, we did our mid-semester check-in, and many of them cited just the anxiety and the stress level that gets lifted because there isn't a cost associated with pursuing our degree program. So we've definitely invested. We are invested in the success of students of color that are pursuing a degree program. So if you have specific questions or would like to know more about the type of services that we offer graduate students that pursue our #1 ranked program, please let me know and I'm happy to answer them. So I don't want to take the spotlight away from Professor Dahlin, so I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Moises. I think actually we're at the end of our time, right, Emma?
We are, yes.
Yeah. So thank you everybody so much for coming to the session. I hope it was informative and interesting. And if you want to email me, I am really happy to talk with you. I am very invested in mentoring and supporting the next generation of folks who want to come into this profession. So yeah, please do not hesitate to reach out, and good luck wherever your endeavors take you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We hope that you will consider either coming back to some more UIUC sessions tomorrow and Thursday, but also check out the INFOcon website for other sessions. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. We've got things going on the rest of today, tomorrow, and Thursday, so I'm sure that there's some more sessions that will interest you. Thank you again, Professor Dahlin, for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us today and to give such a great presentation. I'm going to end the recording now, but we will be able to send this out to those who weren't able to attend and those who were just interested in listening to it again, as well as a PDF of Dr. Dahlin's slideshow. So thank you again. Have a wonderful afternoon or late morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And we'll see you for more sessions during INFOcon 2021. Thank you.